Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is the 20th of April, and this is the weekly podcast talking to Audrey Waters about her hack education posts. Hi, Audrey.
Happy Friday.
Happy? Are you really that happy?
I
Been a hard week, I think.
think so.
So let's start out with another incompleted class for Audrey
I
Waters.
know, I'm a dropout.
Tisk, tisk, tisk. Okay, so I'm thinking of all of the videos, the posts, the PDFs that I've gathered in a variety of places that I've wanted to read and watch, but that I haven't. So let's talk about Udacity. Let's talk about your experience. And what is it about that experience that maybe leads to the disconnect or the dropping out?
It's really interesting. I would say I'm fascinated by MOOCs, the massive open online courses, of which Udacity is probably now one of the most famous. This is the startup that spun out of Sebastian Thrun's artificial intelligence class at Stanford. And he's now offering these free online classes to hundreds of thousands of students, of which I signed up for CS 101, the introductory computer science class. Um, and there were things I really liked about it, but I found myself after several weeks sort of just fading, sort of fading away. I didn't complete my homework, and then I sort of stopped watching the videos and wasn't able to sort of retain my commitment to the class. Of course, this is free. I spent no money on it, and for those who completed the class, you get a letter, like a letter of completion from Udacity. But there's no sort of college credit or things like that. Just the promise that at the end of seven weeks, I think you'd be able to build a search engine, which I can't since I since I dropped out.
Well, we're going to talk about this and Udacity and Coursera as well. I want to propose something. It occurred to me as I read these two posts that although these seem like sort of pioneering efforts, I've wondered if in fact they're not. And indulge me here and tell me where I may be thinking wrong. But it seems to me as though these Stanford-led or otherwise sort of institutionally created MOOCs are are kind of trying to replicate the crowdsourced learning that's taking place independently, but still with a traditional hierarchical structure. And they're still trying to build things in based on that. Now, I know we're going to talk about Coursera and maybe some uniqueness there, but is it possible that that's actually a reasonable interpretation, that this is trying to duplicate the crowd activity, but still with traditional hierarchical content?
I think that you're definitely onto something there. And I think about, like I said, I'm fascinated by the MOOC. I'm actually talking tomorrow at UC Berkeley. I'm on a panel with Philip Schmidt from PDPU, and we're going to be talking about this as well. I think that, we hear a lot about how these classes are scaling, right? They're opening up, they're allowing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students to participate. And so the scaling is in terms of making the class size larger. So how do you perhaps build out the technology so that you can deliver these your class content and assess hundreds of thousands of students. I think that what you're talking about, and I should note here what some of the other MOOCs, particularly those that Stephen Downes and Alec Koros, the DS 106 address. Although they're scaling, it's actually a scaling of people. It's a network connection, and I think that what happens in those classes is very different than what happens when we just think about how can we fill a classroom, a virtual classroom, I suppose, with as many students as possible, and have them move through this still very sort of instructor-driven, instructor-focused content. And so I think that what we're seeing with these large-scale classes is really sort of the next step in a lecture hall that went from 100 students to 200 students to 4,000 students to to hundreds of thousands, without really necessarily rethinking the how how having connections with other people online could maybe decenter the classroom in really interesting ways.
Well, if you think about a lot of the efforts here, like you talked about the things that you liked and the things you didn't like from the course. You liked the short video chunks. That sounded really appealing to me as well. You felt like the forms maybe were a little bit lacking. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of started to dive in there and think, okay, well, forums really need a cruise director. They don't do, especially if you have beginners in there, you really need somebody who sets the tone and the tenor, and they probably don't know that. And then I pulled myself back and said, what am I doing? This isn't necessarily a problem I want to solve, right? What really makes these kinds of environments work is when the crowd gathers together and helps each other. And again, I don't want to make an inappropriate comparison, but like our global education conference that has hundreds of sessions from all over the world, that's a much more attractive model to me than these sort of traditional institutions growing the audience.
Well, it's a different way of thinking about the C. I attended a webinar yesterday that with some of the folks at University of Mary Washington, where Jim Groom and Alan Levine teach, and they were talking about the C in MOOC. Does it stand for class, right? Is this a massive open online class or course, or is the C stand for community? And if you can think about the C as community, that really does shift. I think it's one way of, or in your case, crowd, right? It does shift the focus from again this traditional focus on delivering a set amount of content, whether it's in 2-minute lecture video chunks or not. I think if you turn it open to the community and the crowd, again, it becomes a different thing than a class, than traditionally what we've thought of as a class, at least.
I really like that, and I love the community. I like community better than crowd. I will say that I was fascinated by the Coursera peer grading concept.
This was This was really interesting to me, and I had. I should say that in terms of what sort of news-wise was a pretty dismal week for me. I had a really interesting conversation with Daphne Kohler and Andrew Ning, the two Stanford professors that are founding Coursera. Partially because I think that it brought a lot of these conversations together. One is we'll talk about it in a minute. This question of automated grading, but also really this focus on the peers, and how do you take advantage of having tens, hundreds of thousands of students in a class, so that there's actually peer learning, so that there's social learning, and not just again this sort of unidirectional experience.
There's something else really cool happening with Coursera, right? They've moved beyond computer science.
Yes, which is something I've wondered about for a long time. And we saw Udacity, the Stanford classes that were offered last term, AI, machine learning, and intro to databases. And then Udacity is offering CS 101 and how to build a self-driving car. And then MITx, which is another version of this, offering its introductory electronics class. So far, until Coursera, what we'd really seen was we're really the engineering department taking advantage of this. And in the case of Coursera, they'll be teaching poetry and science fiction and medicine and history, music appreciation. So changing the emphasis away from strictly this engineering focus, and changing the emphasis from the emphasis isn't just on the engineering technology, even though Coursera's founders are engineers. It seems to be about the student, and about the professor and the institution as well.
I don't want to draw too fine a point here or make a comparison that's not appropriate, but I did interview John Hunter this week, whom I really enjoyed speaking with, and he teaches elementary school kids and does this incredible thing called the World Peace Game. But for him, teaching is relationship based, and the relationship is primary. And of course, that makes more of a difference in K-12 than it does in college. But it does feel as though there's these sort of two dueling opinions about sort of scale and scope versus relationship.
Yeah.
And I worry when the technology is all about scale and scope rather than the technology enabling the relationships.
No, and I think that's a really important point. And back to some of my problems, the problems that I had with Udacity. And I think that, I think that there are other questions around this. But when you do open up a class and it's called an introductory class to the world, and you have folks from all sorts of different backgrounds and skill sets there, that's actually an exciting opportunity, or it can actually go sort of terribly awry. And I would say that, again, that a lot of that has to do with what sort of community, what sort of learning community are you creating there? Is this a place where people can find, is this a place for mentorship? Is this a place where sort of experts share openly? Or is this a place in which newcomers are sort of feel unwelcome and afraid to speak up because everyone is sort of having an advanced conversation that they just aren't, they have no idea sort of what's going on in the class. And I think that what I found with Udacity was that in the online forums, at least, a lot of what was surfaced was felt a very unwelcome place for sort of newcomers to participate. And if indeed, as some people say, sort of these classes are the future of the university, then we really, really need to pay attention to that, because that's certainly not, I certainly don't think that the university would like to see itself in the position of sort of automatically excluding, not really being about sort of, teaching and helping introductory level students.
I'm not sure I had thought through this before reading your post this week, but it does seem to me that there's a pretty interesting point there, and it gets really expanded in your story about automated essay grading.
Yeah.
It feels like there's this same huge dichotomy between scaling and ease and numerical output versus kind of relationships and deep thinking. This was the story where I wanted to throw my computer against the wall.
Why? Because it was so long-winded.
Some of the quotes. I wanted to stand up and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not taking it anymore.
Yeah.
I just was so incensed by some of what was said. I was surprised.
Well, I think that this is, this one really sort of strikes at my core, of course, because I'm a writer. I don't like to think of what I do as an automated algorithmic process. I like to think of what I do as sort of creative and authentic and deeply personal, and sort of all my analyses go into creating the work I do. I'm also someone who's taught writing, and so I think about the relationship that I had with my students, and again, creating a community in the classroom, and helping students think about their writing, but knowing too that that's actually not separable from their thinking and their reading. And what does it mean if we're so quick to automate these processes? Sort of, what do we value, and what are we teaching students? Because I don't believe for a minute it's to be better communicators. And I think that in our drive for sort of efficiency, that we're really completely missing the point.
Yeah, I thought this was some of the best writing I've ever read from you.
Thank you.
As well, some of the led me to some of the most kind of thoughtful conclusions for myself, that writing is thinking.
Yes.
And that became very clear to me. And it's not about being grammatically correct, which is easy to measure, but it's about, are you actually doing deep thinking?
I think that writing is also social. And even if you sort of are writing in your diary, I suppose, I think that there's still sort of conversations that you're having with yourself as reader, yourself not just as writer. But I think that in the writing that we ask students to do, again, we're sort of missing a great opportunity when the writing that students do is sort of it's it's not for them, it's just for the teacher, it's not authentic, and that students don't have an opportunity to write for each other, to write for an audience, to work through and think through ideas and share their ideas with each other. And I think telling students that what they've written will be handed over to a robot is sort of deeply insulting about in terms of thinking about what students, helping students feel as though they have a voice that matters, and encouraging them to think, to be thoughtful and critical and articulate and outspoken, and that we would be more concerned with commas and and some of these grammatical issues. It makes me sad. And then someone said too, and I thought was a really profound insight here, is that the reason that computers can read the same as humans, which is what these algorithms have shown, that now computers can read and score papers the same as humans read and score papers. It means that we've taught people to read like computers. That means that we're actually, when we approach students' work, we're already approaching it like automatons. We're judging things on a very superficial level, and we're not thinking about authenticity and agency and all the things that should come with being a literate being.
I did a very poor job of opening this story. Mark Shermis and Ben Hamner examined 22,000 essays. They conclude that robot essay graders are the same as human ones.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so that sort of is the opening to the story. I left with the same conclusion, which was if that means that human graders aren't doing any better than robot graders, the actual problem is with the human graders.
Right. I mean, this is what these algorithms are approximating. These algorithms are approximating the human graders that are hired by the testing companies to assess our children's SATs and state standardized tests. And so, it's perversely backwards. Right.
Meaning they're using different ways of the computer to read to get to the same results that the human readers had, somehow assuming that if they can match the human reader grading using different methods, that is somehow a valuable outcome.
Well, I mean, and the argument is that if we can automate essay grading, then this is the logic, that if we can automate essay grading, then teachers won't have to spend so much time grading essays, which means teachers can assign more writing, which means students will write more. And I'm not sure I believe that chain of equivalence, I don't believe in that logical chain. And hopefully it said, I don't think that writing more for this, in that way just feels so meaningless and awful.
Yeah. So I think you said, or someone said, grading essays is also incredibly grueling intellectually.
It is.
I'd argue as giving meaningful feedback on student writing and by extension on student thinking is hard work. So is this just an attempt to avoid the core critical intellectual hard work?
I don't know. I mean, and I have to, I have to wonder if, I don't mean to be cynical here, but when a university or a school says, we can now automate your essay grading, it's not as though I foresee teachers being freed up to have more time to spend giving their students authentic feedback. I actually foresee teachers having 60 students instead of 30 students and papers to grade. So, I mean, I think that there are interesting labor issues here, and I think that I think it's sometimes we're answering the wrong question and thinking about how do you change what happens in the classroom to make there be more time for people to get authentic feedback and helpful feedback on their writing. I think perhaps again peer review seems like a more interesting way to have your students write blogs, have them write online. To me, that seems more meaningful than having them write for the robots.
So this may come back to haunt me, but I may have told this story before, but I was on train recently and passed through a town in the Sierra Nevada mountain range where they had made ice, right? And that was the industry. And obviously with refrigeration, basically they went out of business. But as I'm on the train sort of riding through this town, I'm thinking, okay, I wonder what the 10 years were like when refrigeration started and the ice makers were still making ice. Did they try and do everything to duplicate the benefits and surface values of refrigeration to the point at which they thought they were competing and then ultimately just kind of died? And is that, again, this may come back to haunt me, but it feels like institutions are madly scrambling to come to the scale and scope of the community and crowd, but doing it as part of their institutional structure, not realizing that, like the ice maker, in 10 years they're going to realize they were obsoleted. Am I going to regret that one?
That's interesting. You know, I start off this particular story with a quote from Mario Savo, and before we got on to record this podcast, I thought, well, I'm going to go get in the mood for this. I'm going to watch him give his speech at Sproul Hall, especially since I'm heading to Berkeley tomorrow. And he makes that really interesting point. I'm thinking about the way in which the university, that the university had become, in the 60s during the free speech movement. And he talked about that the students were viewed as the raw material. And I think if you view students as raw materials, then they really are something to be shaped. And they're objects. They're not subjects. And so until these institutions recognize sort of student subjectivity and agency, I'm not sure that they're going to think of a solution being how can we help empower learners, because I just don't think that that's the way in which they view the student.
I love this conversation, which is why I love these weekly podcasts. Okay, so Tapikio?
Yeah.
How do you say it?
I don't know how you say it. Tapikio, I guess.
An app review.
An app review. This app came highly recommended to me by Daniel Donahue, who's a Australian writer. And he said, I think you're gonna love this open-ended app, which is something that Daniel and I talk a lot about. Is thinking about how are we gonna, are we building tools for particularly for young children are we building digital tools that are really helping them create and not just consume? And so I really liked this app in terms of the fact that this is something that has some structure in place, but really parents could take this app and do all sorts of interesting, and parents and teachers and kids too could build all sorts of interesting things with this app. And I like it when something hasn't been over-engineered so that you only have, three buttons to push and 5 outcomes. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here.
So this reminded me a lot of Instagram and of another program that in our family we're using called Draw Now.
Yeah.
Where you do these little simple line drawings and then precisely guess what they are. Okay, they live in sort of two worlds for me. One of which is, you're right, they're simple and they're easy and they are creation. I love the fact that Instagram allows youth to take photographs and get feedback on them. Well, youth and adults, for us to take photographs and get feedback in a way that was just impossible 10 years ago. At the same time, are they oversimplified?
Interesting. I think that I'm not sure we should confuse open-endedness with oversimplified. I think that one of the and I think that I would argue that Tapikio is certainly more open-ended than something like the drawing game, which you'll quickly find if you play for a while has a very limited. There's a very limited set of words. There's really not a lot you can sort of do next. You can't. It's hard to share your drawings. I guess you could take a screenshot. But I think it's actually a pretty closed, limited amount of things that you could do with a game that even though your imagination let you draw whatever you want. I think what I liked about this particular Tapikio app was that it really is starting to think about the ways in which, how can we help, take better advantage of some of these, of of a mobile device, how can we build things that are more open-ended in terms of learning without necessarily dictating this is a memory card game, this is a storybook app, this is a drawing app. Are there ways to sort of do that more openly?
Anyway, lots of fun. Didn't mean to sound critical, but it's a question in my own mind. Okay, tell us about Wikipedia and college students.
I mean, this actually comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of having sort of authentic assignments. I mean, I do think it's a problem that oftentimes what we ask students to do in class is this doesn't really feel meaningful or real. And Wikipedia has a really interesting program right now where they're trying to convince college or university professors to assign editing a Wikipedia article as part of a course assignment. So perhaps in addition to or in lieu of a term paper, you actually go through and you update, edit, create in some cases a Wikipedia entry on your particular topic, which I think is I think that's actually a very cool idea in terms of having students do real work that matters to them, and that matters to the rest of the world as well. And they've actually just released a study this week that's actually found that these students were contributing sort of much higher quality work than typical new Wikipedia editors, and that these students were actually, it looked as though they were going to sort of remain Wikipedia editors, which is an interesting problem that the organization is facing right now, that it's actually seeing a kind of a rapid decline in the number of people who volunteer to maintain the encyclopedia.
I really love this story. And then I realized I wanted to go further. And because we have such a huge audience of people listening to this podcast, I'm certain someone's going to hear this idea and want to run with it with me. But part of the difficulty with Wikipedia is that you cannot place original content on it. Mm-hmm. So Wikipedia will always be a case of research and, kind of the neutral point of view against competing source material. I would love to see a program, especially for younger students, where they could interview grandparents and relatives, or go to a nursing home, or do stories that are around original content and participate in some kind of a project. I know it won't be Wikipedia, but where the contributions can actually be original content, maybe vetted by teachers. Because it felt like I left the story feeling, oh, this is great, but it's still not placing new. I mean, the world is full of original content that's never going to make it to Wikipedia because maybe a lot of it is biographical.
Right.
But anyway, so that's my idea. I would love to have a kind of a Wikistoria that lower grade kids could actually contribute to, vetted through the teachers, that built through original contributions. That's
interesting. That's a really interesting idea. I like it.
Okay, well, I use the pulpit of our our broadcaster. We'll see if anybody actually responds. Jimmy? Okay. If I threw my computer against the wall on the robo grading story, the essay grading story, then I picked up the pieces and chucked them out of the window when I read about the education innovation.
Jumped up and down into the ground, into little shards of silicon. Yeah, I know the feeling.
I'm going to say this quite candidly. I am so tired of these events. Just really, really tired of them.
Yeah. I just wrote this up this morning. I've been stewing about this all week. On Tuesday and Wednesday, the quote Education Innovation Summit was held at Arizona State University. A great gathering of 800, by the looks of it, investors, entrepreneurs, politicians, to talk about education technology. There were a small number, I think probably count on one hand, number of educators there. And as I watched them tweet some of the keynotes, I could not have been more horrified at what I saw coming from this event that quite arguably had, some of the more powerful and influential people in this country talking about the business of education and the policies around education. This was certainly a room full of powerful people, and I was mortified to see some of the things that were being said there.
So there's a little bit of a dilemma here, and I want to be fair, but it feels as though the whole idea of deep thought research, kind of thoughtful guidance in terms of figuring out education, just gets thrown out of the window with these high-profile, highfalutin events.
Well,
And
Jeb Bush, bless his heart, did admit in his keynote that he does not read education research. So,
well, I'm glad he was keynoting then, right? Because then his words become the things that others will research. Of course, that's
exactly.
the way it should be.
That's the way it goes.
Okay, the dilemma for me was that I was in the car with my wife, and she says to me, because she's not as interested in education as I am. She's not listening to every podcast I do. She says, have you heard about this great thing where a guy in his house has been making videos for students? And I thought, I don't even know how to respond to that. Right? I mean, she's hearing something innovative. She likes the idea that it's innovative. It's a change in education. But there's so much backstory here that I said, have you got an hour? Right? For me to tell you why I'm not convinced this is just this miracle cure. This is a little bit of a dilemma, right? I mean, every new person who comes to the conversation around education is going to come without the backstory or the history of the complexity of the situation. So how do we address that?
I mean, I think these are the things that I've really been stewing on. And I say this as somebody, I mean, I'm a writer. I'm supposed to be paying attention to these things, writing about these things, thinking about these things, analyzing these events, and it's really hard for me to know how to frame how to frame my stories, and how much history to have to and again, a sort of backstory to have to tell about certain people and certain industries, certain theories, certain practices, certain laws. I mean, I think that there's so much going on that when people do see things that seem wildly exciting and new, or they see people speaking about things that seem to resonate with them, personally or politically, it's hard to know how to unpack things for me. And I mean, and I say that as someone, and I guess that's sort of my job to do so.
I don't think anybody would feel comfortable with these same leaders getting together and saying, how are we going to revamp medicine? Although, as I say that, of course, we have that political conversation. But the practice of medicine. I mean, I don't think we hear people coming together and saying, how are we going to change the law? Maybe that's not entirely fair, but it feels as though this is, again, kind of another example of the degree to which the professionals in the business of education are not actually respected as professionals. There's this idea that outsiders are going to come in and remake education.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that I think that oftentimes when people raise the red flag and say, wait a minute, like, we can't actually have conversation, you can't actually talk about technology replacing teachers, and you're pushed back by saying, oh, nobody's talking about technology replacing teachers, don't be silly, don't be alarmist. And then you have someone like Adrian Fenty stand up on stage and say, we're going to, the ideal thing for reform-minded leaders is to, sort of bust the unions, and he said to get rid of the teachers so we can buy more technology. And sort of, it's your worst fears are confirmed about the vision that certain people have for the future of education.
Fascinating. You use the phrase "speaking truth to power."
Yeah.
Feels like that's kind of a mantra for you. I certainly feel like it's a part of your work.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that this is one of the things, though, that I find it's actually sort of it's really difficult. It's difficult to sort of stay. It's difficult to sort of know how do I keep myself separate from how do I keep myself separate from some of that ugliness and still, still be at the table and trying to steer the conversation away from just talking about profits, and remind people that when we talk about disrupting education, that we're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about children's learning, and everyone's learning, and tread carefully when you're talking about blowing things up and using metaphors of warfare to talk about this.
Okay, and a story that I actually think may also be a little bit about institutional protection
Mm-hmm.
is this first sale doctrine story.
Yeah.
Now we've seen in the case of computer software that the first sale doctrine has essentially been kind of thrown out. This idea that once something is sold to you, the original creator has no control over how you use it afterwards, right?
Yeah.
But it's been used in the software industry as a protection, right? That you don't actually buy the software, you license it, and so you're not legally allowed to resell it. So is the same thing happening with textbooks?
I think that this is, I think that this is connected to the question of software, and I think that now we're seeing in some ways sort of digital content in general, raising all sorts of questions about ownership and copyright. I think this textbook, the question of textbooks too, is also reminds us of sort of the of of our global world, and the fact that we have, particularly when it comes to digital content, that we don't have these barriers to buying and selling things like we did before. So I think that this will be an interesting case to watch, not simply because this particular Supreme Court case deals directly with textbooks, but also because of the implications in terms of for sale.
It feels like a lot of these rules that were set up to protect the consumer, like we talked about last week, get turned around and used to protect the institution.
Mm-hmm.
And this is bothersome to me.
Yeah.
Okay, more textbook stories, slug books and academos.
This is interesting. A couple of, I guess, almost a month ago now, we talked about Rafter, the launch of Rafter, and they released a tool, a textbook price comparison tool for faculty, and now we're seeing a couple more online textbook resellers and textbook platforms do the same thing. It's going to be interesting to see it'll be interesting to see if having more transparency around price is the leverage point to change some of the textbook practices. But I think it's also I think just in terms of sort of seeing a flood to a particular market, that clearly this is something that the market again is interested in looking at.
It may be wishful thinking, but like the comparison with the ice makers, it almost feels like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I still have a really hard time believing the textbook is going to last. Enough said. Open Study has tweaked the way it hands out badges.
Yes, this was this was a news item that was announced at the Education Innovation Summit. I should put the little footnote in there that the Open Study is an interesting company. This is they work with MIT OpenCourseWare, for example, creating this sort of massive online study group for some of these for informal learning, and for folks who are both in college classes and sort of DIY learners. A place that you can go and get peer support if you're working through a particular subject. They've a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, they introduced badging so that you could sort of award people badges if they were helpful or and supportive. They decided to sort of rethink how they recognize people's participation by giving them a score instead of a badge, which I thought was an interesting again, sort of this interesting rhetorical move now, and thinking about how we're, whether it's a badge or a score, sort of how we're certainly interested in this sort of, I don't know, a mechanistic view of assessing people's participation in learning.
California is requiring eighth graders to take algebra. Again, another wonderful move of mandatory control. But does this make any sense?
This was an interesting study out of UC Davis, and perhaps not a surprising study either, that found that mandating that every eighth grade algebra or every eighth grade student take algebra could possibly do more harm than good, particularly when those students are already struggling, particularly if they don't have the support that they need already. That this is going to sort of add to add to these students' sort of poor performance. It's not actually a particularly surprising study, but I think it's a couple of people asked me how it connected to calls to require all students take programming, for example. And I think that the answer has to be, how are we going to we have to be thinking about supporting students and not just mandating, not just sort of mandating things. Like, do we have the support in place for them, and if not, why not that?
I keep having really interesting conversations with people who teach math. I love Alice Keeler's concept that math shouldn't be a graded endeavor, but it should be an achievement level endeavor. Mm-hmm. So you get to certain places where you have learned certain content, and like a game, that's your achievement level, rather than skipping over stuff that you don't understand, getting a poor grade on it, and moving on to the next. But I'm also having conversations with people who are sort of in the Dan Meyer camp of really teaching mathematics in a way that's engaging.
Yeah.
Who are having trouble keeping their jobs.
Yeah, and I have that in my list of weekly roundups. I have the recommended post by Dan, thinking through, how do we build math tasks, he calls it, but how do we think about the math curriculum so that it's engaging and perplexing, and that students can really sink their teeth into it and not feel that math is something sort of punitive, which I think that these sort of mandating certain classes certainly feels that way.
Florida is defining a cow as a predator, unintentionally, of course. But what does this tell? This is Florida's standardized science test with some problems.
Well, this is, and there was another story in the news just today that this is this time of year for standardized state testing. New York City had its standardized held its standardized tests this week too, and there was news today of a couple of really problematic stories that just didn't make sense in terms of what we're asking students to respond to in these tests. In the case of Florida, a science teacher just took a close look at the practice tests and the content and just found numerous errors in terms of some of the definitions and that students were being asked to repeat, including a definition of predator that would certainly mean that cows are predators.
Okay, you love a guy named Michael Berube?
I sure do.
Tell me why.
I would say that this is in part sort of the legacy of being a PhD student in literature, and having taught writing and rhetoric and composition, which is what he teaches at UPenn. He's been a long time advocate, I think, for thinking really thoughtfully about the value of a liberal education, thinking about the importance of teaching writing, teaching literature. And he's currently the president of the Modern Language Association, which is sort of that field's membership group. And he's made it one of the cornerstones of his presidency to really look closely at the issue of adjunct and non-tenure track faculty on campuses. And because they just launched a database where you can actually look at universities, compare the universities, and see what percentage of their teaching faculty are tenure track and what percentage are actually non-tenure track. I think this is a really important labor issue that certainly someone who, although I didn't finish my PhD, was walking down that path of looking at what the job market is like when you've committed 7+ years to a PhD. Thinking about what the job market is like is a pretty scary proposition as more and more universities are turning to adjunct faculty, non-tenure track faculty, which means you have no benefits and no job, your contract sort of semester to semester contract. So I think it's important stuff for thinking about the future of labor on university campuses.
How did the One Laptop Per Child Foundation respond to the Peruvian test scores issue?
Well, not surprisingly, they were very displeased at the economists' interpretation of this study from Peru, and they spent some time highlighting the successes of the program, arguing that we are seeing some cognitive improvements in students that have them, and that this is actually I think that they sort of wanted to challenge this notion that we should just be focusing on math and literacy achievement scores. And it's interesting. The post that I wrote last week continues to get all sorts of comments on it. So,
what kind of comments?
I think people really debating the efficacy of the initiative. I think having questions too about having questions about whether or not sort of it's sufficient to hand out laptops without proper professional development for teachers is technology sort of the important piece here, or is the laptop the important piece here, or are we overlooking other important issues? And again, I think that this question too of how are we going to measure success of a program like One Laptop Per Child?
You report that the Digital Harbor Foundation received $200,000 to support its EdTech Link program.
Yes.
You call them the awesome new nonprofit in Baltimore.
Yes.
So this is tech-related teacher training as well as after-school programs for Baltimore public students.
Yeah.
Want to tell us any more about that?
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting and innovative program that Shelley Blake Plock is now running. He's the head of the Digital Harbor Foundation. This a long time Latin teacher, now turned sort of community learning advocate. I think that this, when we think about communities like Baltimore, like Detroit, like New Orleans, places that are really facing absolute, it's a lot economic, devastation. How can we rebuild not just the schools? How can we rebuild the community? How can we help? How can we offer more and do more? And I love this idea of working with after-school programs. Students will gain some tech skills that they'll in turn go back and help teach their teachers at their school technology, teach their parents about technology, and also have some opportunities for work to do some web development, for example, for the community. And so I think that this is really great. This isn't just about sort of giving people computers. This is really thinking about how these skills can empower students and how that can sort of spread throughout the community. I'm really excited that Shelley's taking this on.
How fun. Okay, so Sophia, the sort of social tutorial site, I actually did an interview with Don, has been acquired by Capella. I didn't get the feeling that Sophia was getting a lot of traction. Were they?
I don't think so either. I mean, I don't know. I think I don't think I've written about them again since my initial coverage when they launched. It's certainly an interesting, interesting idea. One of the first, I would say, one of the first companies that really, I think, saw early the potential of catching the sort of riding the Khan Academy wave, if you will, of having other people build small video presentation like learning objects to share with one another. But I don't know if anything really happened. I never really saw much traction, and I'm not surprised considering Don's history with Capella that the company's been acquired.
Okay, Audrey, we're both going to hope for a better week next week.
Indeed.
A more uplifting week.
Indeed. But you've got big plans for this weekend, so that'll be...
That's right. For the Social Learning Summit, which by the time this recording is out, will have actually taken place. But I am loving these and these sort of crowdsourced virtual events. So my previous comments need to be taken in the context of that I do feel like there's something more that can be done with actually involving the community. But Audrey, thank you so much. Great writing this week. Really insightful. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.